As a massive fan of old school light gun games, I'm always on the lookout for new modern ways of revisiting these classic titles without the need for a CRT TV. I've previously reviewed the Sinden guns, which are awesome, but they're fairly complicated to set up and require you to source your own emulators, front ends, and configure all of the software to get them running. Looking to solve some of these issues are the retro shooter light guns. These aim to be a plug-and-play solution to your modern light gun woes that are as uncomplicated as possible while also being accurate and providing great build quality. However, do these actually succeed where other modern light guns have failed, or are you still better off just sticking with your good old-fashioned CRT? Well, let's take a look. Before we pull the trigger on the review, remember that a premium coffee table book, A Handheld History, is now available in retail stores and on Amazon. Definitely give it a look if you're a fan of portable gaming. I also should mention that the retro shooter light guns were sent to us for the purposes of review, so a big thanks to the folks at Retro Shooter for sending them out. Now, the first thing you should know about these is that you don't actually just get the gun like you do with something like Sinden. You actually get a whole box of goodies, with a Pandora Box mini PC, 2 light guns with 4 IR sensors, and 2 foot pedals in order to take advantage of games like Time Crisis. So really, if you choose to buy the retro shooter guns, it isn't actually just the guns you're investing in. It's also an entire pre-configured system with thousands of games pre-installed for all of your gaming needs. This makes the retro shooter an extremely attractive concept for someone who doesn't want to be messing around with configuring complicated software or considering downloading games from dodgy websites. It's all just here and ready to go. So we've eliminated one problem by making the experience revolve less around downloading and configuring different pieces of software, but by doing that we've also introduced a new issue, which is the sheer amount of hardware required to get these working. So let's talk through it. When you receive the retro shooter guns, you'll notice that they arrive separated into 2 sections. This is supposedly to avoid any complications with international customs, and it is understandable considering that they're basically replica firearms. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to mistake these for a real gun, but it's probably best to be safe just in case. What's great though is that you're provided with all of the tools needed to attach the guns together, not only with the screws but even a little screwdriver too, and this process is really easy. There is also a little cable that needs to be attached inside of the 2 sections of the gun, but again this is super obvious and a really simple setup. The guns themselves look great, with both a red and a blue one, so it's easy to differentiate between players, and there's lots of little details like the markings and indents on the gun barrel and the details on the grip, which make it feel comfortable to hold, and it definitely looks like a high quality product. Not only do the guns have a clicky trigger which feels great to pull, but 2 buttons and an analog stick on the left and another larger button on the right. These inputs are primarily used for menu navigation, which eliminates the need for an additional controller or a keyboard and mouse. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with what we've got here. On paper, this all sounds great. You've got no software to set up and you've got well-built guns that look and feel amazing. But despite this emphasis on keeping things as simple as possible, what isn't so simple is the amount of wires that you're going to have to be dealing with. Because this setup relies on hardware rather than software, you've actually got to plug quite a lot of stuff in to get everything working. So you've got the Pandora Box system itself, which needs a power cable, a HDMI cable, the double-ended cable used for the guns, with one end to provide it with power and the other used for the recoil effect. And by the way, this recoil effect is a really nice feature to have, and it provides a good kick when it's active. But honestly, I do tend to just leave this unplugged because it becomes a bit annoying after a while. And then finally, you have the 4 IR sensors which need to be mounted to the corners of your display so that the guns can detect where the boundaries of the screen are. These 4 sensors are powered by USB-C to standard USB cables, and when you combine all of this stuff together, you can see how things would quickly become overwhelming. Something I should point out is that I actually had to supply some of my own equipment to get this working. The provided HDMI cable didn't work with some of the ports on my main TV, and my capture card wasn't picking up a signal from it. Swapping this to one of my own HDMI cables fully solved these issues though, so I can only assume that the provided HDMI HDMI isn't the best quality. I was also provided with a single double-ended USB-C cable, but this was only enough to power 2 of the 4 IR sensors. So I needed to use 2 of my own USB cables to power the remaining 2. As a knock-on effect of having so many of these USB cables, I also needed to provide my own USB hub because there's nowhere near enough USB ports on my display or on the Pandora Box to power everything without this. The intended method of mounting the sensors to your display is with these provided sticky pads, but these were awful and the sensors ended up either falling off completely or just drooping down and partially covering the screen. So I decided to just use some blue tack to stick these to the bezel of my display, and this worked like a charm. It would have been a lot better for the sensors to have come with some sort of clamp so that you can attach them to the display properly, but hey, blue tack works too, I guess. Needless to say, when all of this stuff is finally set up, it can end up looking a little bit messy, which to be honest, drives me a little bit insane. So when you've finally got all of this set up, is the end result actually worth it? When you turn the Pandora Box on, you'll be greeted by the main UI where you search for games and can filter them into different categories to make finding a particular game easier. You'll probably notice that there's a hell of a lot of games here that aren't actually light gun games. That's a little bit confusing considering the whole point of this is to plug guns into it, but if you go for the Retro Shooter Gold package, you're actually provided with some standard controllers in order to take advantage of these additional games. You get 2 NES-style controllers and 2 PlayStation-style ones, and these are just straight up terrible. They're extremely light and they feel like they were made with the cheapest quality plastic possible, and they use disposable AAA batteries instead of being rechargeable. So I tried plugging in an Xbox 360 controller and an 8BitDo SN30 controller, and it detected them straight away, and every game I tried played perfectly. So if you're looking to take advantage of some of the standard console games on here, it might be worth seeing if any controllers you have already will work, rather than using the provided ones. But let's get back on track and talk about the light gun games. There's a huge amount of choice here, with practically every light gun game accounted for from the 5th generation or before. It's a bit weird how some of the games are the console ports instead of the original arcade versions, but I'm personally not too bothered by this. The greatest thing about this whole setup is that it just works. You select a game and everything is already perfectly configured to the inputs on the gun, the calibration is pretty much perfect across every game I tried, and even the menu navigation is simple thanks to the gun having lots of buttons and an analog stick. Because there's so many games at your fingertips, this turns out to be a great way to discover stuff that you've never played before. The fact that everything here literally just works and the guns are pretty darn accurate too just makes the experience an absolute delight once you finally got it all set up. The ultimate way to test light gun accuracy is by playing point blank, and I'm happy to report that the retro shooters definitely passed this test. It very occasionally will lose accuracy, but it'll quickly recalibrate itself, and a lot of the time it felt like I was playing it with the real hardware. I think that this is an area where it's actually tied, if not maybe even slightly better than my experience with the Sinden guns, and considering that this is much more seamless to get up and running, it might be a good alternative. I do think that the retro shooters probably should have come with instructions though. Not only talking you through the setup process with the hardware, but also talking you through the software side of things. I had to work out how to access the emulation quick menu by just mashing combinations of buttons and hoping for the best, and it would have been nice to have actually been provided with this kind of information. If you're wondering how to do this, all you need to do is hold the 2 buttons on the left side of the gun for 3 seconds and the quick menu will pop up. This quick menu is pretty important too, because this is where you'll find your save states, the option to quit back out to the game selection interface, and the ability to switch to a 4:3 aspect ratio. Why the default setting stretches it to 16:9, I have no idea, but at least you do have the option to fix this. By far the biggest problem with this whole setup though is that even though I enjoyed playing all of these games through the Pandora Box, it does sometimes struggle with certain slightly more demanding games. House of the Dead 2 has some graphical glitches on certain textures, and Time Crisis Project Titan runs at about 90% speed, which just takes you out of the experience a bit. Any games from the 6th generation like Time Crisis 2 aren't even on the device at all, probably because they would run so poorly that they would be unplayable. This is disappointing because if the Pandora Box had significantly more power behind it, this could have been the ultimate all-in-one lightgun machine. This situation is actually pretty annoying because it's so close to being there. If a few of these issues were ironed out, this could be a product that I would recommend to anyone. The whole thing just needs a little bit of fine-tuning in a few places, but I do have to say that the guns themselves are awesome. Something you might find interesting though is that the retro shooter light guns are in fact compatible with a normal PC setup. You do need one of these Firebase adapters, which are an additional purchase provided by Retro Shooter, but this is probably worth the extra cost because it massively expands the capabilities of the guns because you're no longer bound to the Pandora Box. If you're playing a native PC game like the House of the Dead remake, then this is actually surprisingly simple. Literally all I did was plug the guns and IR sensors into the Firebase adapter, launched the game through Steam, and it worked. Now, considering I couldn't even get the Sinden gun working properly with this game at all, this was pretty impressive. After this success, I decided to try out a pre-configured front end made specifically for the retro shooters, which was created by Scotty Retro and available on the Arcade Punks website. This unfortunately wasn't a simple process, and even after a lot of tinkering with settings, it never felt quite right. However, I did get a handful of games running, and even though the accuracy wasn't as good as when I was using the Pandora Box, what I did manage to get working was still playable. The issue with this is that because it's not a simple plug and play setup like it is with the Pandora Box, you're probably better off sticking with Sinden if you're specifically looking to emulate retro systems on your PC. Because Sinden are probably the most popular modern light guns, there's far more guides and pre-configured builds available, which might end up making them easier to use than the retro shooters for this particular purpose. All of this just ends up making me feel all the more disappointed that the Pandora Box isn't more powerful, because that aspect of the retro shooters is definitely what makes it stand out. But now let's finally tackle that massive elephant in the room and talk about the price. The pricing of the guns fluctuates based on which package you decide to go for, but for the purposes of keeping things simple, I'm only going to talk about the basic Retro Shooter Pro tier. The other, more expensive options give you access to the controllers and some arcade sticks, but honestly, they're not really worth the additional cost. So the Pro package is normally $302.97 and comes with the 2 guns, the Pandora Box, the 2 pedals, and the 4 IR sensors. If you wanted to add on the Firebase adapter to use the guns on a PC, this is an extra $37.97. Something else to consider is that these prices don't include shipping costs, which will change depending on where you're getting them delivered. But for me in the UK, this would have added on another $54 to the total price. This brings the grand total to $394.94, which is approximately £310 here in the UK. Now this sounds quite expensive, and to be honest it is, but you might have noticed with your beady little eyes that the Retro Shooter guns are currently on sale, which brings the cost of the Retro Shooter Pro package down to $233.97, which is approximately £180, but that is without shipping or extras. So depending on exactly how passionate about light gun gaming you are, this might actually be worth it. To put it into perspective, a 2-pack of Sinden light guns without recoil costs £170, which is slightly cheaper than the sale price of the retro shooters. But when you consider that the retro shooters come with a whole console, the guns have the recoil, and they're easier to set up, it probably works out to be a better deal. So I'm giving the Retro Shooter light guns 6 dodos out of 10. They actually surpassed my expectations in some areas, but are somewhat flawed in others. They're more accurate than I thought they would be thanks to the 4 IR sensors, and because they come with the Pandora Box, which already has everything you need to get started pre-installed onto it, they're much more simple to get up and running than other alternative devices. It's also pretty great how it comes with some extras like the foot pedals, the additional gun, and the fact that both of the guns feature the recoil effect. All of this ends up making it feel like you're getting quite a lot of stuff for your money. Where the cracks start to show though is with the amount of wires you're gonna have all over the place, which just looks a bit messy for my taste. I also needed to supply several cables and bits of equipment on top of what was supplied, and there's the fact that the Pandora Box isn't very powerful, resulting in it lacking a lot of iconic games and sometimes struggling to run what is there. It's also not a very simple process to get the guns working to their full potential through a PC, and even if you did manage to get everything working properly, you'd still have a lot of wires all over the place, which just wouldn't be ideal. But I do have to say, once I actually started playing with the guns and everything was working as it should, a lot of the issues I had with the retro shooters did just vanish from my mind because of the amount of fun I was having. But let me know what you think. Are the retro shooters worth it, and is this the right direction for modern light guns to be taking in terms of having their own dedicated console, or do you prefer the Sinden way of being purely based around PC compatibility? As always, if you enjoyed the video, then give it a like, subscribe for more retro content coming very soon, check out A Handheld History now available on Amazon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.